Before we descend into the smoke and fire of that March morning, I need you to understand something. I need you to know who I was before that flight, because only then will you comprehend the magnitude of what I witnessed and why it destroyed me. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because this story transcends borders and time. This is about the moment a true believer's eyes are finally opened, and he can never close them again. I was Major Klaus Richter, Luftwaffe, bearer of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and on March 4th, 1944, I flew over Berlin and saw the truth that would cost me everything. They called me the Iron Eagle. 87 confirmed kills over 5 years of combat. I had flown in the Battle of Britain, over the Eastern Front, through the burning skies of North Africa. I had seen friends incinerated in their cockpits, watched young pilots I had trained disintegrate under enemy fire, carried the weight of command through countless missions where I sent boys to their deaths. But I never questioned. Not once. I believed in the fatherland with a faith that bordered on religious fervour. My father had died in the trenches of the Great War, and I had grown up on stories of betrayal, of how Germany had been stabbed in the back, humiliated, broken. The Reich promised redemption, promised that we would rise again, that our sacrifice meant something. I gave them everything. The morning of March 4th began like any other at Tempelhof. The cold bit through my flight suit as I walked across the frozen tarmac, my breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Berlin had endured another bombing raid 2 nights prior, and the smell of burning still hung in the air, mixing with aviation fuel and the bitter scent of a dying winter. My orders were simple: high-altitude reconnaissance flight over the city and surrounding areas, document damage, identify strategic vulnerabilities, report on civilian morale and infrastructure status. Standard procedure. Nothing that should have changed my life. My Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. Weighted, pristine and deadly, a testament to German engineering even as the Reich crumbled around us. I had flown this exact route dozens of times. I took off at 0547 hours, climbing through the pre-dawn gloom into skies that were eerily empty. The Allied bombers had returned to their bases in England, and our own forces were spread impossibly thin across too many fronts. As I ascended above the clouds, Dory, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful but instead felt like a wound opening in the sky. At 6,000 meters, I leveled off and turned back toward Berlin, my camera equipment humming, my notepad ready for observations. The city spread below me like a patient on an operating table, its secrets about to be exposed. I had no idea I was about to perform an autopsy on everything I believed in. What I saw in those first moments seemed familiar. Bombed buildings, rubble-strewn streets, the ugly scars of war that I had witnessed countless times before. The districts near the government sector showed the heaviest damage, which made tactical sense. The Allies were trying to break German morale by destroying symbols of power. I made my notes with mechanical precision, documenting grid coordinates and damage assessments. But then I began to notice the patterns, the details that didn't align with the narrative we had been fed day after day through propaganda briefings and official reports. The destruction wasn't random. It was systematic, comprehensive, and far more extensive than anything command had acknowledged. Entire neighbourhoods had been reduced to ash, not just military targets but residential areas, schools, hospitals. I banked north, following the Spree River, and that's when I saw the exodus. From 6,000 metres, they looked like ants, thousands upon thousands of civilians streaming out of the city in ragged columns, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage on their backs, in carts, in baby carriages converted to cargo haulers. This wasn't the orderly evacuation of military dependents we had been told about. This was panicked flight, desperate masses fleeing a city that could no longer protect or feed them. I descended to 3,000 metres, violating protocol, needing to see more clearly. The faces that looked up at my aircraft showed no patriotic fervour, no confidence in final victory. They showed terror, exhaustion, and something worse, the hollow eyes of people who had already accepted defeat even if their leaders refused to admit it. I pulled up sharply, my heart hammering against my ribs, and turned toward the government district. Perhaps there I would see evidence of the resilience command spoke of, The mighty war machine still functioning, still capable of turning the tide. Instead, I witnessed something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The Reichstag and surrounding buildings were fortified, yes, but not for continued governance. They were being prepared for abandonment. From my vantage point, I could see the telltale signs: reinforced bunker entrances being expanded, supply depots being emptied and transported south, vehicle convoys forming up with military escort heading toward the Alps. The leadership wasn't preparing to defend Berlin to the last man as they proclaimed. They were preparing to run, to save themselves while leaving the city to burn. Then I saw the construction that would haunt my dreams forever. In the Grunewald forest just west of the city centre, massive excavation operations were underway despite the bombing campaigns, despite the resource shortages that meant frontline soldiers lacked ammunition and winter clothing. Scores of workers, probably forced labour from the concentration camps we weren't supposed to know about, were building elaborate underground complexes with multiple escape routes leading to concealed airstrips. These weren't defensive positions. These were luxury bunkers, complete with ventilation systems, multiple levels, storage facilities for art and valuables. The party elite were ensuring their own survival with resources that could have fed thousands of starving Berliners. The hypocrisy was so absolute, so monstrous, that I actually felt my worldview beginning to crack like ice under pressure. I circled wider, documenting everything with my camera, filling page after page of my notepad with observations that I knew would never appear in any official report. The factory districts told their own story of collapse. The massive industrial complexes that were supposed to be producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for final victory were operating at perhaps 20% capacity, and he had been bombed into uselessness, but others stood intact yet silent, their machinery idle not from enemy action, but from lack of raw materials, lack of skilled workers, lack of coal and electricity. The economic infrastructure that sustained modern warfare had been bled dry by 5 years of total war, and no amount of propaganda could conjure resources from thin air. We were fighting with shadows and promises. The residential neighbourhoods revealed the human cost with brutal clarity. I flew low over working-class districts in Wedding and Kreuzberg, areas that had once been strongholds of support for the party. Now they were wastelands of rubble and despair. People queued for hours at distribution centres for rations that were clearly inadequate. Children, skeletal and hollow-eyed, picked through debris looking for anything salvageable. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, with wounded lying in the streets because there were no beds, no medicines, no hope of proper treatment. This wasn't the home front heroically supporting the troops as our newspapers claimed. This was a population at the edge of total breakdown, held together only by fear of the Gestapo and the fading hope that somehow, impossibly, things might improve. I climbed back to altitude, my hands trembling on the controls, and turned east toward Alexanderplatz. The city centre told the story in architectural terms. The grand buildings that had symbolised the 1,000-year Reich stood like broken teeth, their facades crumbling, their windows empty sockets staring at the sky. The victory monuments, the parade grounds where we had celebrated triumph after triumph in the early war years, were abandoned and littered with debris. The propaganda ministry still stood, its walls covered in fading posters proclaiming final victory, but I could see the truth now. Every message was a lie. Every promise of secret wonder weapons that would turn the tide was a fantasy designed to keep people obedient for a few more weeks, a few more months, until the leadership could complete their escape plans. The military installations revealed the ultimate betrayal. I documented 3 major Wehrmacht bases in and around Berlin, and all told the same story. Equipment was being stripped, not for deployment to the fronts where desperate soldiers needed reinforcements, but for transportation south and west. The best vehicles, the remaining fuel reserves, the stockpiled supplies were being diverted to support the evacuation of high-ranking officers and party officials. The rank-and-file soldiers, the men who had bled and died believing they were sacrificing for the fatherland, were being abandoned like pawns in a chess game where the kings and queens were fleeing the board. I had seen cowardice before, but never on this industrial scale, never this systematic betrayal of everything the military code supposedly stood for. As I flew over the Tiergarten, once a magnificent park where Berliners had strolled and families had picnicked, I saw it had been converted into a massive improvised graveyard. Thousands of wooden crosses marked hasty burials, and fresh graves were being dug even as I watched. The official casualty figures we received in briefings bore no resemblance to this mass burial ground. We had been told that civilian casualties were minimal, that the city's defences were holding, that morale remained high. But the Earth doesn't lie. Those graves represented tens of thousands of dead, victims of bombing raids, starvation, disease, and the systematic brutality of a regime that valued ideology over human life. Each cross was an indictment, a silent testimony to the cost of the lies we had been told. I turned south toward Tempelhof, my mind reeling, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The flight had lasted 43 minutes, but it felt like I had aged years. Every assumption, every article of faith that had sustained me through 5 years of war had been stripped away, leaving only the naked truth. Germany was defeated. Not in some distant future when the Allies finally broke through, but now, today, in every meaningful sense. The infrastructure was gone, the economy was destroyed, the population was broken, and the leadership was preparing to abandon ship. All that remained was the dying spasms of a mortally wounded beast, and those spasms would cost countless more lives for absolutely nothing. As I descended toward Tempelhof, I saw one final image that crystallized everything. A group of Hitler youth, boys no older than 14 or 15, were being drilled in the streets with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real weapons. Their instructors were elderly Volkssturm members, the last desperate scraping of the barrel, men who should have been spending their final years in peace now being called up to defend a city that was already lost. These children and old men were being prepared to face battle-hardened Allied armies with training weapons and patriotic slogans. It was obscene, it was evil, and I had been part of the system that made it possible. Every mission I flew, every enemy I killed, every order I followed without question had brought us to this moment of absolute moral bankruptcy. I landed at 6:30 hours, taxied to my assigned space, and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Ground crew rushed to service my aircraft, their movements mechanical, their eyes carefully avoiding mine. They knew. On some level, everyone knew. But knowing and acknowledging were different things, and acknowledgement meant confronting the abyss. I climbed out of the cockpit with my camera and notepad, and for a moment I just stood there on the wing, looking at the activity around me. Pilots preparing for missions, mechanics working on damaged aircraft, officers studying maps and issuing orders, all playing their parts in a grotesque theatre where the ending had already been written, but no one dared speak it aloud. Intelligence Officer Hauptmann Weber was waiting for me in the debriefing room, along with 2 men I didn't recognize wearing the black uniforms of the SS. This was unusual. Reconnaissance debriefings were typically routine affairs, quick reports followed by written documentation. The presence of the SS meant someone was concerned about what I might have seen, what I might report. Weber's face was carefully neutral as he gestured me to a seat, but I caught the warning in his eyes. Be careful. Say only what they want to hear. Survive this moment. But I was already past caring about survival. I'd seen the truth, and it was burning inside me like phosphorus, impossible to extinguish, consuming everything I had been. They asked me for my report, and I told them everything. I didn't soften it, didn't use euphemisms or strategic terminology to disguise what I had witnessed. I described the exodus of civilians, the abandoned factories, the luxury bunkers being built while children starved, the mass graves in the Tiergarten, the systematic stripping of military resources for the benefit of party elite. I showed them my photographs, read from my notes, laid out the evidence of comprehensive defeat and institutional betrayal. The room grew colder with each word I spoke. Weber's face turned ashen. The SS men's expressions hardened into masks of controlled fury. But I continued, my voice steady, detailing every observation with the same precision I had used to document targets over England 5 years ago. When I finished, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. One of the SS officers, an Obersturmbannführer with cold eyes and a mouth like a knife wound, spoke first. He told me that my observations were the result of altitude-induced hypoxia, that I had clearly suffered some form of mental break from the stress of combat operations. My photographs would be confiscated for security review, my written report would be classified and sealed. I would be placed on indefinite medical leave pending psychiatric evaluation. It was all very professional, very efficient, the machinery of denial grinding away the evidence of truth. But then he leaned forward, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he explained what would happen if I spoke of these observations to anyone. My family would be investigated for defeatism. My career would end in disgrace. My legacy would be erased. Or, and here he paused for emphasis, there could be an accident during training operations, a malfunction, a tragedy that would earn me a hero's funeral. I told them I understood perfectly. I saluted, turned, and walked out of that room knowing I would never fly for the Luftwaffe again. But more than that, I walked out understanding that I faced an impossible choice. I could remain silent, protect my family, preserve my life, and become complicit in the continuation of a lie that was costing thousands of lives every day. Or I could act on what I knew, speak the truth regardless of consequences, and become part of the resistance that was trying desperately to end the war before Germany was utterly destroyed. There was no middle ground, no comfortable compromise. The truth I had witnessed from 6,000 meters above Berlin demanded a response, and whatever I chose would define who I actually was beneath the uniform and medals. I spent that night in my quarters, not sleeping, weighing my options with the same analytical precision I brought to combat tactics. The safe choice was obvious. Say nothing, accept the medical leave, wait for the war to end, survive into whatever came next. Most of my comrades chose this path, and history judges them neither heroes nor villains, just men who tried to navigate an impossible situation. But I kept seeing those children with wooden rifles, those civilians fleeing with everything they owned on their backs, those graves multiplying in the Tiergarten. Every day of continued war meant more of them. Every weak command maintained the fiction of possible victory meant more sons sent to die for nothing. Could I live with myself knowing I had seen the truth and chosen comfortable silence? The answer came to me as dawn broke on March 5th. I couldn't. Whatever happened to me personally, whatever price I paid, I had to act. The oath I swore as an officer was to Germany, to my people, not to a regime that was preparing to abandon them. True loyalty meant telling the truth even when, especially when, that truth was devastating. I had connections to the resistance through my late wife's family, contacts I had never activated because I believed in the cause. Now I would use them. I would provide my documentation to people who were trying to negotiate a reasonable surrender, who were working to preserve something of Germany beyond the ashes. I would become a traitor to the regime in order to remain loyal to my country. The irony wasn't lost on me. Making that decision was strangely liberating. For 5 years I had carried the weight of absolute certainty, the burden of being right, of serving a cause that demanded everything and promised transcendent meaning. Now, in choosing betrayal, I felt free for the first time since 1939. I was no longer required to defend the indefensible, to explain away the inexplicable, to maintain faith despite mounting evidence. I could simply see clearly, act according to conscience, and accept whatever consequences followed. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I was stepping off a cliff, but at least I would fall with my eyes open rather than continue marching blindly toward the abyss. Over the following weeks, I made contact with the resistance network. I provided my documentation, my photographs, my detailed observations to people who were compiling evidence of the regime's crimes and failures for presentation to the Allies. I attended meetings where officers and civilians planned various schemes to shorten the war, to preserve infrastructure, to protect civilians from the worst of what was coming. Most of these plans failed. Some of those people were arrested, tortured, executed. I lived in constant fear of the midnight knock on the door, the black Mercedes arriving to take me away. But I also experienced a clarity of purpose that had eluded me throughout the war. I was finally fighting for something real, not ideology or propaganda, but the actual survival of human beings. The cost was everything, of course. By May, the Gestapo had connected me to the resistance. I avoided arrest only by disappearing into the chaos of Berlin's collapse, living under false papers, moving constantly, surviving in the ruins of the city I had documented from above. My military career ended, my reputation destroyed, my family forced to denounce me publicly to protect themselves. The Iron Eagle became a traitor, his 87 kills rendered meaningless, his decorations stripped, his name added to the lists of defeatists and criminals. If Germany had somehow won, I would have been executed as a war criminal. But I had seen the truth on March 4th in 1944, and once you truly see, you cannot unsee. You can only choose whether you will act on what you know. Berlin fell on May 2nd in 1945. I was there in the ruins, watching Soviet soldiers raise their flag over the Reichstag. The city I had flown over 14 months earlier was unrecognizable, a moonscape of rubble and ash where hundreds of thousands had died in the final desperate defense of a regime that had already abandoned them. The party leaders I had watched preparing their escape had indeed fled, many successfully evading justice, living comfortably in South America or under American protection, while the people they betrayed picked through ruins searching for food and shelter. The betrayal I witnessed from my cockpit had played out exactly as I feared, only worse, always worse than you can imagine until you see it with your own eyes. I survived the war, barely, and spent the following decades trying to understand what I had witnessed, what it meant, why I had remained blind for so long. I was not unique. Millions of Germans served the regime with genuine faith, believing the propaganda, trusting the promises, convinced we were the wronged party seeking righteous restoration. We weren't evil people, most of us, just people who wanted to believe, who needed simple explanations for complex problems, who were seduced by the promise of greatness and the comfort of absolute certainty. The real evil lay in how that faith was exploited, weaponized, turned into a machine that consumed everything it touched. What I want you to understand, what I need the world to remember, is that truth doesn't require your belief to remain true. On March 4th, 1944, Germany was defeated, comprehensively and irrevocably. That was objective fact, verifiable from 6,000 meters above Berlin. But the regime continued fighting for 14 more months because acknowledging that truth would have meant admitting their ideology was bankrupt, their promises were lies, their sacrifices were meaningless. So hundreds of thousands more died in a war already lost, cities were reduced to rubble that could have been spared. Countless atrocities were committed in the name of fighting to the last breath, all because the people in power chose comforting lies over devastating truth, and those of us who knew better remained silent too long. The weight of that statement is what I carried for the rest of my life. Not guilt for the enemies I killed in combat, not shame for the regime I served before I understood its nature. Those things I could rationalize, contextualize, explain as products of their time and circumstance. But the silence after that flight, even the brief silence before I acted, that was my personal failure. I saw the truth with absolute clarity, and my first instinct was still to protect myself, to weigh personal consequences before moral imperatives. I eventually chose conscience over comfort, but that hesitation, those hours of calculation, they haunt me because they reveal something about human nature that we desperately want to deny. We are capable of seeing evil and still choosing complicity if the price of resistance seems too high. What would I have done if the consequences had been greater? If speaking out meant not just my death but my family's execution, my children tortured before my eyes? I can't answer that honestly because I wasn't tested to that degree. Many people were, and many chose silence to protect those they loved, and I cannot judge them because I don't know what I would have done in their place. But I do know this: every small silence, every moment of going along to get along, every decision to not rock the boat because the personal cost seems too high, these accumulate into the conditions where great evil becomes possible. We think of moral courage as dramatic moments of defiance, but it's actually built from 1,000 small choices to tell uncomfortable truths, even when silence would be easier. The men who threatened me in that debriefing room, who confiscated my evidence and tried to silence my observations, they were also making choices. They knew the war was lost as clearly as I did. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable to anyone who looked honestly at the situation. But they chose to maintain the lie because their power, their status, their entire identity was built on the foundation of eventual victory. Admitting defeat meant admitting their lives had been wasted in service of a false promise, so they continued to send boys to die rather than face that truth. This is what happens when institutions value their own preservation over the people they claim to serve. The mechanism isn't unique to Nazi Germany. It's a human pattern that repeats across cultures and eras whenever power becomes disconnected from accountability. I'm sharing this story now, decades later, because I see the same patterns emerging in different forms. Not the same ideology, not the same circumstances, but the same fundamental dynamic. Leaders who refuse to acknowledge failure, institutions that prioritize their own survival over truth, populations that want to believe comforting promises rather than face difficult realities, and individuals who see the gap between propaganda and truth but remain silent to protect themselves. The specific details change, but the pattern remains constant. And it always ends in unnecessary suffering that could have been prevented if enough people had chosen truth over comfort soon enough. What I learned from those 43 minutes over Berlin is that clarity of sight is both a gift and a curse. Once you truly see, you lose the comfortable fog that makes daily life manageable. You become responsible for the knowledge you possess, and that responsibility demands action even when action seems futile or dangerous. Most people never experience that moment of absolute clarity, or they experience it and successfully bury it beneath layers of rationalization and denial. I couldn't. The images from that flight burned themselves into my consciousness with such intensity that they couldn't be explained away or forgotten. That clarity destroyed the life I had built, but it also allowed me to retain something of my humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The question that haunts me isn't whether I did enough after seeing the truth. I know I didn't. No individual could have done enough to significantly alter what was coming. The machinery of destruction was too massive, too advanced, too deeply embedded in every aspect of society. The question that actually matters is whether I would have found the courage to look in the first place if I hadn't been forced to by circumstance. Would I have volunteered for that reconnaissance flight if I'd known what it would reveal? Would I have sought the truth actively, or would I have been content to remain in comfortable ignorance as long as possible? I want to believe I would have been brave enough to look, but I'm not certain, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of truth worth acknowledging. To the young people watching this, trying to understand how ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil, I offer this insight from someone who lived through it. We didn't think of ourselves as evil. We thought we were patriots, defenders of our civilization, victims of unjust treaties fighting for rightful restoration. The propaganda was sophisticated, the peer pressure was immense, and the consequences of dissent were severe. But none of that absolves us of responsibility for what we chose to believe, what we chose to ignore, what we chose to do even when doubt whispered in our minds. Every generation faces its own test, its own moment when truth and comfortable lies stand in opposition, demanding choice. Your test won't look like mine, but it will come, and when it does, remember that the human capacity for rationalization is infinite, but the consequences of self-deception are very, very real. I flew over Berlin on March 4th, 1944, and saw the truth of our defeat with absolute clarity. That truth destroyed my career, endangered my family, forced me into hiding, and transformed me from decorated hero to wanted traitor. But it also gave me the one thing that mattered when everything else was stripped away. I could face myself in the mirror. I could know that when the moment came, when I had to choose between comfortable lies and devastating truth, I eventually chose truth even though it cost me everything. That's not heroism, it's the bare minimum of human decency. But in the landscape of moral catastrophe that was Nazi Germany, even the bare minimum required more courage than most of us possessed. I'm not asking for praise. I'm asking that you learn from my experience, that you develop the muscle of truthfulness before the crisis comes, that you practice small acts of courage so when the great test arrives, you'll be ready. The men who built those luxury bunkers while children starved, who stripped resources meant for defending soldiers to finance their own escapes, who maintained propaganda about final victory while preparing their own flight. Those men were also products of human nature. They weren't alien monsters, but people who convinced themselves their survival was more important than their honor, their comfort worth more than their conscience. They chose themselves, moment by moment, decision by decision, until they had traveled so far down that path they couldn't imagine turning back. The distance between decorated war hero and corrupt betrayer of trust is shorter than we want to believe. It's measured not in dramatic moments, but in daily choices about whether convenience matters more than principle. If you take nothing else from my story, understand this: truth exists independent of whether we acknowledge it. Berlin was lost on March 4th, 1944, regardless of whether the regime admitted it or I reported it. The only question was how many more would die before everyone accepted what could have been seen from the beginning by anyone willing to look honestly. The lie didn't change reality. It only made reality more painful when it finally forced recognition. Every day spent in denial was a day stolen from finding honest solutions to real problems. This principle applies far beyond military defeats. In your own life, in your communities, in your nations, reality remains what it is, no matter how sophisticated your rationalizations. The only choice is whether you face it soon enough to respond constructively, or wait until you're overwhelmed by consequences you could have mitigated. I ended my life as neither hero nor villain. Just a man who saw too much, waited too long, acted too little, but still acted. My 87 victories mean nothing now. The medals were stripped and melted down. The glory faded into ash and rubble. What remains is the knowledge that at least once, when it genuinely mattered, I chose truth over comfort. That's the most any of us can hope for, and it's more than many achieve. If this story makes you uncomfortable, if it challenges your assumptions about your own courage or the reliability of your own leaders, then I've succeeded in my final mission. Comfort is the enemy of growth. Discomfort is where we learn who we actually are rather than who we imagine ourselves to be. I never flew again after that medical leave in March 1944. My career as the Iron Eagle ended the moment I chose to document truth rather than accept comfortable lies. But in a strange way, that final flight was my first moment of actual moral vision. Everything before had been tactical excellence in service of strategic blindness. I had been an expert at the wrong things, brilliant at destruction while remaining ignorant of what I was actually destroying. That 43-minute flight forced me to see the whole picture, the human cost, the institutional betrayal, the moral bankruptcy. It was agonizing and necessary in equal measure. Sometimes your defining moment isn't your greatest victory, but your most devastating loss, not when you soar highest, but when you finally see clearly the ground you've been bombing. To those who serve institutions, who wear uniforms, who follow orders and trust that the system has legitimacy and good intentions, I offer this warning from hard experience. Your loyalty should always be to principles rather than organizations, to people rather than power structures, to truth rather than propaganda. Institutions will use your dedication, your courage, your willingness to sacrifice, and they will direct those noble qualities toward ends that may be anything but noble. You have a responsibility to verify independently that your service aligns with your values, that the cause you're fighting for deserves the price you're paying. That verification is uncomfortable, difficult, and sometimes impossible while remaining in good standing with the institution, but it's necessary, because history is filled with good people who served bad causes with absolute sincerity and woke too late to realize what they'd been part of. The exodus I witnessed from 6,000 meters, those thousands streaming out of Berlin with their worldly possessions on their backs, they were the face of institutional failure rendered in human terms. Every one of those refugees had believed the promises, trusted the leadership, sacrificed for the cause, and in the end, they were abandoned, left to survive or die based on their own resources, while those who had demanded their loyalty fled to safety. That's the reality of power when accountability fails. The people at the top ensure their own survival while those at the bottom pay the price for mistakes they had no part in making. This pattern wasn't unique to Nazi Germany. It's how power operates when unchecked by functional accountability. Your job, regardless of your position or society, is to be part of the accountability mechanism rather than the exploitation machine. I spent my final years trying to document what I had witnessed, to create a record that might help future generations avoid similar catastrophes. This account is part of that effort, a first-hand testimony from someone who was there, who saw clearly, who paid the price for that clarity. I'm not asking for sympathy or admiration. I'm asking that you extract the lessons from my experience and apply them to your own circumstances. The specific details of your moral tests will differ, but the fundamental dynamic will remain constant. There will be pressure to conform, consequences for dissent, rewards for going along, and there will be moments when you see clearly that the emperor has no clothes, that the cause is lost, that the promises are lies. What you do in those moments will define you far more than your victories or accomplishments in service of illusion. The title of this story mentions that I knew it was over. That's accurate, but incomplete. I knew more than just that we had lost the war. I knew that the entire edifice of belief I had built my life upon was rotten, that my sacrifices had been exploited, that my faith had been weaponized. The military defeat was devastating but comprehensible. The moral defeat, the realization that I had been complicit in an evil system while believing I was serving a righteous cause, that was the wound that never healed. You can recover from tactical failure. You can survive military defeat. But how do you recover from discovering you've wasted the most productive years of your life in service of a lie? How do you reconcile the person you thought you were with the person you actually were? Those are questions I wrestled with until my final day, and I never found completely satisfying answers. If I could go back to that morning of March 4th, 1944, knowing what I would see and what it would cost me, would I still take that flight? I've asked myself this question thousands of times. The honest answer is I don't know. The life I lost was comfortable, respected, purposeful in its own limited way. The life I gained was marked by fear, exile, loss, and with the burden of a knowledge I couldn't share safely. But I also gained something irreplaceable. I learned who I actually was beneath the uniform and ideology. I discovered I had enough residual humanity to choose truth when it mattered, even at great personal cost. That's a more valuable discovery than any military decoration, but I wish I'd made it at a lower price, and I wish I'd made it sooner. If my story encourages even one person to ask hard questions earlier, to resist the comfortable lies before they calcify into doctrine, then perhaps the price wasn't entirely wasted. The final lesson I want to leave you with is about the relationship between seeing and acting. Seeing clearly is necessary but insufficient. I saw the truth with perfect clarity on March 4th, 1944, but even then I hesitated. I calculated. I weighed consequences. The gap between seeing and acting is where moral courage lives or dies. Your life will present you with dozens, perhaps hundreds of moments where you see something wrong, unjust, false, or cruel, and you'll face the choice of whether to speak or stay silent, act or abstain. Most of those moments won't be dramatic. They'll be small, quotidian, easily rationalized. But each small silence trains you for larger ones. Each small act of courage prepares you for the great test. Build the habit of truth-telling in small matters, so when the great matter arrives, you'll have the muscle memory to do what's right even when it's terrifying. I was Major Klaus Richter, the Iron Eagle, 87 confirmed kills, servant of the Reich, until that service required me to ignore what I had seen with my own eyes. Then I became something else, something smaller in worldly terms, but perhaps larger in human ones. I became a witness, a traitor to power in order to remain loyal to principle, a man who finally opened his eyes even though he couldn't bear what he saw. This is my testimony, my warning, my final mission. May you have the wisdom to see clearly, the courage to act on what you see, and the good fortune to live in times that don't require you to choose between your life and your soul. But if such times come, and they come for every generation in different forms, may you choose better and sooner than I did. That's all any of us can hope to leave behind. The possibility that someone who comes after might do better than we managed, might learn from our failures and avoid repeating them. That's the only redemption available to people like me, and I grasp it with both hands.